So what do we mean by learning and the learning process? Like what's going on in our brain when we're trying to learn something new? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, and hopefully you're going to get an understanding about what is learning, what isn't learning, and what's actually going on in your mind when we're learning something new. So my name is Jared. I am a nurse educator, a certified nurse educator, a neonatal nurse practitioner, a learning coach, a respiratory therapist, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the learning process. Now let's think about how we learn things. We went to a lecture for like our biology course or whatever, and the teacher presented us with a lecture, and we went home and we made some notes and some flashcards. We read our assignments. Um, what happened in our brain? Like, did it actually get into our long-term memory? Did it just kind of float around? Were we unsure of a lot of concepts? Were there gaps in our knowledge? So putting information into our brain isn't as simple as just, reading it on paper and you'll be able to regurgitate that later and apply it to all sorts of different situations. It's a lot more complicated and it's a lot more difficult than that. Now let's talk about memory first. So we have two types of memory. We have our short-term memory and we have our long-term memory. Our short-term memory is just that. It is short. It is temporary. It is limited. It can only hold a couple bits of information, like a phone number, or if you think about your when you get one of those SMS messages about your login code that you shouldn't be sharing with anyone. It's usually like a seven-ish phone number type chunk of information, and we remember that when we need to log into our system, and then it's gone. It's not going to any type of long-term memory. Which is next, which is our long-term memory. So this is the memory that stores a very, very large amount of information. It will hold things there almost permanently, depending on what's going on and how often you're using that information. But like if you need to refresh your information on that, it can come back pretty quickly. But the trick is, how do we get things to go from our short-term memory to our long-term memory? Let's talk about learning. So learning is that process of moving information from short-term to long-term memory. It's not straightforward. It's not an easy thing to accomplish. But we also have to remember what learning actually is when we look at learning versus performance. So just being able to get a good grade or a bad grade on a test doesn't mean that you really do or do not know the information that's being communicated in your course. It could be things like test anxiety comes into play, so you can know information very well and then choke when the exam comes because you're just too panicked. It also depends on the evaluation system. If it's something you're not familiar with or the questions are poorly worded, or let's just say the questions themselves happen to be stuff that you didn't spend as much time focusing on because you were kind of going about it alone, you can get a poor evaluation, even though if they asked you to explain other parts of the things you were learning, you could explain it pretty well. And we also need to remember that learning is not memorization. Memorizing bits and chunks of information don't mean that we can apply it to different situations, that we can explain it, that we can apply that when we're out there working with similar concepts or theories. Memorizing is just that. You can use it in you can use that chunk of information for one thing in one manner, and it doesn't always apply to learning and doesn't always help with learning sometimes. Sometimes it actually can hurt your learning. But just know that learning is not memorizing, and performance can kind of, give you some skewed information on the actual learning outcomes. So learning process involves three overwhelming or overarching steps. We have encoding, which we take the information in. We store it, which means we put it either into our short-term or long-term memory. And lastly is retrieval. So we take that information out of our brain and we do something with it. It's not just sitting in there doing nothing. So we have a three-step process that goes into learning. Encoding. So encoding is the very first thing. We take information in. And attention is one of the biggest factors here. So as long as we're being deliberate with what we're doing and the information, and we're taking it in, we're paying attention to it, we'll maximize the chances that that's going to get into our storage. If we're being distracted, we're multitasking, we got a lot of stuff going on, so we're studying, we have like our phone Not somewhere around here, but we have our phone out and we're looking at it every couple minutes. We're not in the moment. We're not paying attention to what we're trying to do and being deliberate. It's going to impair. It's going to create this new barrier to learning because now we're distracted. We're not focusing on everything, on the important things that we should be focusing on. Then we have to process that information. So we get the information in, and we need to do something with it to make sure that our mind knows that there's a reason this information is going to need to stick around. We can have a shallow understanding or a deep understanding of the material that we're learning about. The shallow understanding is just going to be our surface level things, so our rote memorization things. You think that the one that everybody likes, I always love hearing this one when we talk about mitochondria. And we say mitochondria, and everyone says powerhouse of the cell. And it's like, okay, what's that mean? I don't remember. I just remember it's the powerhouse. And like, yeah, that's a very shallow surface level understanding of what actually goes on with that mitochondria. However, we can have a deeper understanding. That's what we want when we're truly trying to learn something. We want a deep understanding of it. We know what it means. We can connect it to other topics. We know where it sits in the big picture of things. And that's what's going to truly lead to our mastery of understanding and knowledge on a topic. When we talk about attention, we also have to think about engagement. So how engaged are we with this information? So we can either be passive or active. So passive are things like note-taking, reading your textbook, rereading your textbook, rereading and re-listening to your slides, just sitting in a lecture. Those are passive things. They don't require you to do anything or do anything with that information. You sit there and it's like a hose getting sprayed in your face. It's just blah, 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 blah. It just keeps coming. If we don't do anything with that information, that's it. Some of it it's like the expression throwing spaghetti at the wall. Some of it, a couple strands may stick, a lot of it won't. But what we want is active engagement. We want to be actively involved with whatever topic we're trying to learn. The traditional method of this has been essentially, your homeworks and your assignments. They don't come out and just say, like, this is how you're going to learn the information. They give you these assignments with the context that you don't know that these are what's going to be reinforcing your learning. It's not sitting in lectures and listening. Learning doesn't happen during the lectures and the listening. The lectures are your opportunities to ask for clarifications and bring questions and ask for those things to be engaged with that information. If we're not being engaged and we're not using that information to answer questions, or we're not searching that knowledge base that we have or our textbooks to find answers to questions, we're not actively engaging with that content, and it's not ever going to reach our long-term memory. So we need intention and we need engagement with the information if we truly want to learn. And there's a good distinction here to make, is that even active strategies can become passive if we're not using them appropriately. The one I always like to remind people about are note-taking and flashcards. Flashcards will make you look busy. You can spend a whole lot of time making flashcards, and trust me, I've been there. I've done a lot of this wrong. Like, that's kind of the whole reason I'm making these, is because I want whoever's out there in the position I was to not make the mistakes I did and hopefully learn that beforehand. But you can look real busy making flashcards, and you can spend a lot of time making flashcards. I've spent hundreds of hours probably making flashcards and probably thousands studying flashcards. I remember I had decks of 2,000 to 3,000, and I'd go over them every single day, and it ate away at my life. And at the end of the day, while I was busy and I was like, yeah, I studied for 8 hours today, or 20 some hours these past couple days, and I went over this number of flashcards. Test came and I only had some memorization things figured out. Like, if they asked me to answer a question where I had to apply or analyze something, like, unless it was the exact thing I had in a note card, I didn't know. I couldn't have been the wiser. So it's important that we're using active strategies, and we're using active strategies well, because if we're only using our passive strategies, that's only going to set us up for failure. And when we're encoding, there are things we can do to make that process a little bit stronger and strengthen it. The big one is building connections. So learning an isolated piece of information as just a single fact is going to be very difficult when it comes to recalling that information later. The way our memory works is we have a node of information. So let me get my hand figured out there. We have one single node, or this point of information. we want that information to connect here and here and here and here, because every time we want this information, it's going to pull from our prior knowledge. So like, hey, we encountered it here. Boom, there's one pathway. We applied this in a situation. Boom, there's another pathway. We connected it to two other things we learned about. Boom, there's two more pathways. So now instead of having a single node of information, we have 4 or 5 different pathways that we can think and we can kind of travel down that are going to lead us to that single piece of information. So we don't want a single piece of information in isolation. We want to build a web and a big network of how we can get to that information, how we can apply that information, how it's relevant to other situations we've been in. And that's what's going to strengthen our learning and our deep knowledge on topics that we want to learn about. If it's just a single fact, we pull that fact, and that's it. We can't do anything with it. It's like knowing, in healthcare, I always talk about this one too. It's like knowing a normal value for electrolytes. So we have like a sodium, which is like around like 135 is normal for that. That's great. That's a single piece of information. It doesn't do a whole lot for us if we can't apply that to different situations. So let's say it's 133. How bad is that? Is that really bad or just like kind of bad? Are they going to see symptoms? What are the symptoms? What can cause that to happen? How do we correct it? What patients with different disorders may that be normal for? Like there's a whole lot of other things we can do with that information. But if we only know a single number, it's just that. It's a number. It's not going to get us any closer or any further knowledge on our subjects. And then when we get on our test day and we take an exam or something, or we get in a situation where the doctor gives you, or the lab gives you back a report and you see 135 or 134 on paper, that's it. You don't know what to do with it any further. And I always use this for our patients in the real world setting, is if we only... or if we're in our exam setting, if you know that the normal is 135 to like 145, and there's a test question that asks, what's the normal range for sodium? Cool, you got it. But how often does that happen? You know, they ask you bigger questions. A patient presents with a blah, 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 along with this, and that. What's the problem? What's the underlying diagnosis? What's our next steps? What's the best response? What's our first response? Like, there's a lot of things you need to know about that. And just knowing that number it's not going to get you very far. It'll just get your foot in the door, and you still need to go a little bit further before you can actually apply that information. All right, let's get back into storage then. So storage is when we're consolidating that information. So we take that information in, we need to consolidate it. So we're pressing it down, or you want to condense it into useful pieces of information that you can use later. And this benefits from what's called spacing. So we're not just going to take this information in and think about it once and be done with it. We're going to think about it, and we're going to think about it again, and we're going to think about it again. And we're going to talk about this more specifically in the next upcoming slides. But before we get to that, we want to talk about sleep and consolidation. So adequate sleep is going to support your consolidation of information and all of your learning. There's no doubts in anyone's mind anymore that sleep's important to the whole learning process along everything else. And if you don't get enough sleep, you're going to be less likely to learn in the way that you want to, and it's going to impair your memory along with a lot of other poor functions. But that's all we got to say on that topic. All right, so we talked about retrieving this information at frequent intervals. So what we're always fighting against is what's called the forgetting curve, or the Ebbinghaus curve. So we learn something, and the moment we learn it and take it in, a clock starts ticking. It's a countdown. And it's counting down to how long that information is going to be in our mind, and it's going to be retrievable and usable for us. If we sit in a lecture, we take that information in, even if we do everything we can actively with it at the time, it's going to start dropping like this curve here. I think I can bring up there we go. So we learn it in our lectures, and our memory of it is going to just drop. Our timing, our clock's ticking for how long we're going to be able to use that information. And hopefully we aren't down here when test day comes, because that's not going to be a good thing for us. So we want to do what we can to make sure that this curve doesn't slope down like this. We want it to move upwards or stay where it's at. So what we do with this one is called spaced repetition or spaced retrieval. It's got a couple different names. But with that, it is just that. We are retrieving that information. We're encoding it. We're retrieving it at regular intervals. to make sure that we're going down those pathways and those thinking memory pathways, to revisit and reevaluate and reuse that information and apply it to new situations. So what we do is we get in our lectures, we maybe later that day or the next day, we do a study session, and boom, our knowledge of it comes back up. And then we wait, a day or two, our knowledge of that kind of slips a little bit and goes down. Boom, we study again, and hopefully we get to a better point then. And then again, we can space it out a little bit further, study session, boom, bring our knowledge back up. And then we kind of let it space out a little further depending on where we need to go with it, and boom, we can bring our knowledge back up. So hopefully we're sitting around this point when it comes time to take our exam, and we're not sitting down here. And what people like to do, or what's kind of a habit of a lot of people, is cramming. So they're going to do their spaced repetition, but it's only going to be one massive session. So they're going to do their lectures and take it in, and they say that would fit perfectly over top of it, but it's going to go down, 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 down. And then they cram, and they do a cram session, and it gets them to maybe up here, and they study the next day right before the test. And they're taking their test and their knowledge levels here, when if they were studying every so many days, they could be up here and get a way better grade than if they just crammed it. The other problem with cramming it is not being effectively coding. So it's not going into that long-term memory. It's going to sit in that short-term memory, and when that exam's over, a lot of that information is just gone. They're not going to be able to remember it or use it in any situation. If it's a class that's scaffolding, so you have like your intro level here, the next one's a little bit harder, the next one's a little bit harder. If you did this for your level 1 course, and you still have to take a level 2 course that's going to be using that information that assumes that you understand those foundational things, and you go to that course and you don't understand those foundational things, you're just going to fail. That you're going to have to either go back and relearn and revisit all of that information that you missed, or you're just going to fail and you're going to have to start over again. So yeah, we don't want to cram. We want to make sure we're doing this spaced at some different intervals. We'll talk about specific ones a little bit in another lecture, because it's a whole technique we need to learn, but this is just the general ideas of what we need to do with our learning process. So organizing ideas. So like we talked about earlier, a single piece of information doesn't do us any good. We need to know how that single piece of information connects to this point. Move this right, this point, to 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 this point. Again, the bigger web that we weave with that node of information, the more memory pathways we have and the more connections we have, and it's easier to go down each of those pathways. I always say this is like a pathway in the woods, or whatever they call it in your place, but your wilderness or your forest. If there's a path that only gets walked down once, it's going to get overgrown. There's going to be weeds and branches and everything growing over it. But if we're going down that pathway real frequently, it's going to be worn down. It's going to be a little bit more clear. Stuff's not going to be blocking and making it harder to get down it or through it. That information is going to be easiest for us to get there. And the more ways that we can get there, the better, because if there's, the expression I say is like a tree falls on one and you can't go over it, or like in a video game, your path is blocked or Snorlax is in the way. If we have another way to get there, we can still get there, and we can think about it, and we can get there that way. But if we don't have those other pathways built, and we're only relying on one way to get to that information, then if anything happens to that one way, we're kind of stuck at that point. And I always like to say and give the thought example, or what I've been taught is this thought example when we think about apples, or just the word apple. So when you think about apple, in your head, do you see the letters A-P-P-L-E? Well, I don't. I don't anticipate anyone out there does. But we got to think about that apple. So we'll see, and we'll think about it, and we have like an image of an apple in our head, and we think about, the different colors that apples can be. We think about how they're crunchy, or they're soft, or they're sweet. We think about the time we went to the grocery store and they had a whole bunch of apples on the table, or the little pile, the produce section part there. You could get them big ones, there were small ones, they were in bags, they cost differently. You didn't know half the names of them, but there were a whole bunch of different names. They can get cooked in a pie. You remember what they tasted like. You remember that time you went to the orchard and you picked apples, and you were hanging out with your friends that day, and what you were, it was a kind of a cold day, but then you warmed up with this. And yeah, that's not like letting your mind necessarily wander. It's just recognizing that you have pathways that take you from here to here to here to here to here to here. And let's say if we only needed to remember that there's a couple different colors of apples, like, yeah, we have a whole bunch of ways that we could have got there. Yeah, that's a simple, basic explanation, but just know that the more ways that we can organize ideas and the more ways we get to those ideas are going to be the better. So we kind of want to have to group things. So we want to organize like this information about the apple's taste, this one about the color, this about where it grew, this about where you can buy it, this one's about like the different like varieties, which maybe I like Cosmic Crisp, but I know people like Honey Crisp, and some people hate them, but Cosmic Crisp are where I'm going to draw the line there. But I don't discriminate. I'll take all of them. So that's kind of where our lines are with that. So make sure we're kind of chunking and grouping those bits of information, and we have like fine connections and we have big connections, and it's all going to be able to take us to the information at the end of the day. So retrieval is how we're getting that information out, not necessarily how we're applying it, but how we're going into our mind to find that information. And there's two basic principles here. We have cued and we have uncued. So cued retrieval is what happens when somebody asks you, what is the mitochondria, or what does mitochondria produce? You have a hint that's going to get you down that road. So you take a test question, and it asks you a question, and it gives you some multiple choice options. There's cues or hints in that question that should be pointing you to what that right answer is. And sometimes, there are even distractors that are going to try to get you to go to somewhere else, but we actually want you to go to the one. So just know that cued is some type of hint that's going to get your memory to go to that point. On the other hand, we have what's called uncued. So this is essentially you have your blank slate in your mind, and you have to generate the general information about that, how it's organized, how it's structured, how it's grouped, how it relates to other topics, without any type of hints or without any type of information trying to get you to that. You have to come up with all of that from your mind. So you can think that if you are able to use uncued retrieval more, yeah, you're probably going to have a better mastery of a topic, and if you are using the cued type retrieval. And as you can imagine, and what you're probably seeing, what we're trying to get to is that effort is productive. If we are always thinking or studying or doing our study sessions on the easy mode, we aren't going to have a deep understanding or a long-term understanding of our topic. We're going to have a shallow understanding. We are going to be familiar with the terms and the concepts. And what I mean by familiar is if they wrote down like 100 terms on a piece of paper, 17 of them were related to the topic you're studying. Like, you could point 15 or so of those out on the topic. You couldn't tell anybody what they meant or what you do with that information, but you were able to at least recognize them. And that's part of learning. That's very low on your Bloom's taxonomy list, is just recognizing. But when you're asked a test question or you're put in a world situation where you have to apply that information, you're not going to be ready to do that. Mediums are sweet spot. That's where we want to keep everything. We want it to be necessarily difficult. If it's too hard, then it's going to just kind of fall into gaps, and we're going to see that we have all these problems with our memory or our knowledge on the topic. So if we have a extremely difficult way that we're trying to study or a difficult topic, and we don't have any of that information ready for us, then yeah, it's going to be way too hard. And if you're playing in hard mode and you're not ready for it, you're just going to get your butt whipped, and that's not going to be what's effective for learning. So too easy, you're not going to build memory. Too hard, you're just going to burn out. But we want to keep things right in the middle, in that medium difficulty. So it should be challenging. It should feel challenging. It shouldn't feel too easy. But just make sure that you have to kind of make that judgment call on your own. Is this too difficult, or is this kind of like just right difficulty? Next, we have interleaving. So when we're talking about studying things, we can either kind of study as a block. So that would be like maybe like one subject. Or we can do a interleaving strategy where we're mixing subjects or parts of topics. And this is, again, building that web or that network that we have in terms of our memory and the pathways we can get to information. This is also more reality-based. So it's more like what you're going to be encountering in the world, the real world. No one's going to come up to you in the hospital and be like, hey, what's a normal sodium? Like, no, you're going to have to be doing a whole bunch of other things at a single time. You're going to have a lot of questions, a lot of other information that's coming in that you need to kind of discriminate through and figure out what's important and what's not important. And that sodium question is just going to be one important element of that. And being able to study with like that interleaving strategy is what's going to kind of mix that up and make it more meaningful and more real world. Because we do have some problems where if we're kind of studying and we're studying things that are always like the same or similar to each other, or we go in the same order, our memory is very good at identifying that order, and you'll just memorize the order instead of like the actual information you're going to want to learn, which we talk a little bit this, we'll talk a lot about this when we talk about flashcards, which I have planned pretty soon. So we want to be purposeful about our interleaving strategy. So we are going to include information that are in the similar topic across like the same course. We're not going to make our algebra or history homework mix with our biology homework. Like, yeah, there's some overlap in some situations, but for the most part, we're going to keep it to like courses. So like, let's say we're talking about like cell division and cell destruction and their difference, and cell replication. And they're all, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, yeah, we can mix the order of that. So instead of doing chapter 1 first every time, we're going to put 3 first one day, 2 first one day, 5 first one day. The key point is we're not always following that same order, because when you do A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, you're going to remember things in A, B, C, D order. We want to be able to distinguish that information from other pieces of information. So always make sure that we're kind of mixing things up and doing things not in the same order. So retrieval is what's going on in that retrieval process, and that learning process. And there's what's called the testing effect. So yeah, this is what we're doing in our classrooms when we take our exams and we're trying to get our good grades and everything like that. It's not. It is an evaluation method because that's the best strategy anyone has been able to come up with. Unfortunately, it's the easiest to grade. It's simple to give somebody a 50-point multiple choice test and say, you got a 40% or you got a 40 on it, which gives you an 80% grade, and you're good enough to move on, versus a 45 and you got a 90. It's just the evaluation or the testing method we have. When we're studying, though, and we're thinking about this testing effect, it's not necessarily to grade how well we know the information. It is used to expose our knowledge gaps or the holes in our learning. So we're trying to retrieve this information with stuff like practice questions and being challenged and having open-ended questions on those topics. And that is going to give us the opportunity to identify what we don't know. So we want to know what we know, and we want to know what we don't know. Because sometimes there's different levels to what we know and what we don't know. And as long as we're able to identify those what we don't know moments or topics or subjects, we can kind of focus where we're going to put our most of our effort that's going to have the biggest bang for our buck on us. Because if we're only studying the stuff that we know and that we know well, that's great, but you only need to strengthen it so much to have a pretty good understanding on the topic. If you know one element of your course, let's say you know chapter A very well, but chapter B, you don't really know a whole lot of it, like, yeah, you should spend a lot of more time studying chapter B than chapter A. Like, you don't neglect chapter A, you still be spaced about it, and every, so many days, maybe it's days, sorry, my camera is the different way, but you just make sure that you're spacing your repetition with that a little bit wider or further out than if you were doing something new or complicated or that was difficult for you. And that brings us to the end of this one. So if you enjoyed this one, I hope you did, and give me a like, a comment, a subscribe. If you would like to learn more about learning and learning with AI more efficiently, I have a book out on Amazon that you can pick it up in the description. Subscribe and comment and do all that good stuff, so I know that somebody is out there listening to me. I know it's kind of a new and small channel, but I'm hoping we're able to, reach a lot of students out there and clear some problems up that I had, so that way you don't have to suffer through them as well. So I hope you enjoyed. Get my book if you're interested in it. Send me a comment, like, subscribe, all that great stuff, and I will talk to you in the next one.